in now, or she is in. So Madam Chair, it looks like all members are present for the meeting.
Perfect. So are we?
Madam Chair, we are now live.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. Happy July. We call to order this meeting of the Intergovernmental Legislative Relations Committee. All members are present. And we have an agenda before us. We start with consideration of R-21-181, establishing federal priorities for the city of Albuquerque to the community project program funds of the Congress of the United States. We've got our federal representatives or our lobbyists, John O'Donnell, with us. Maybe you would like to start with some background, Mr. O'Donnell.
Sure. I didn't hear the end of what you said, Madam Chairman, because I got some message on my screen about recording this session. So I think you said that would I like to start by making a few remarks about this process?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Madam Chairman, members of the committee. It's been a while since we talked about earmarks and the federal program for the city of Albuquerque. I want to make a couple of just general observations before I get into making more remarks about where we are. One is in the process this year, and I think Mr. Padilla and Mr. Manacucci experienced some of these things, and we've talked about them. Looking at the city's capital outlay request with the legislature and how those match up with the federal appropriations. Also developing the federal program and identifying projects in the fall. The role and the importance of the role in the Intergovernmental Legislative Committee, this committee, in this process of looking at priorities and projects. And then something that we've not been able to do so far this year, but I think we need to be looking at it for the January, February timeframe of this coming year, are virtual or in-person meetings with the congressional delegation. So I'd like to recognize the excellent work that city staff, the mayor's office, the city council did, and the committee did in helping us identify projects. We were sort of in the process of looking at our federal program when all of a sudden Congress made the announcements in February and March that they were going to start earmarking appropriations and surface transportation legislation again. So we went through the process with the committee of vetting projects in I think it was early March and through March. But about the middle of March, what happened was the House Appropriations Committee identified exactly what the parameters were for earmarking in the FY22 budget. And what they indicated was House members would only get 10 member requests. That doesn't mean they would get 10, but they would be able to request 10. That they thought, and this is not a hard, fast rule, but you might get, one member might get as much as $20 million in requests, but that's the ceiling, that's a parameter. It wasn't something that was cast in stone or cut in stone. And they also limited the number of federal program accounts that could be earmarked. The House had about 33, and when the Senate announced that it was going to take earmarks, it had a few more. Essentially, they were the same, but the Senate had a few more that it included. So the city, we had about 13 earmarks. That included 11 appropriations and 3, I want to say it was, well, I'll say 2 because the rail trail had 2 phases. So we had 11 appropriations requests. We had 2 authorization earmark requests. The rail trail phases 2 and 3 and Unser Boulevard between Kimmick Drive and Paradise Boulevard. We also learned something else this year, which is kind of a general thing, and that is it's good to have your congressional district seat filled by somebody rather than having a vacancy, because that really created some difficulties for us this year with the authorization requests for earmarks in the Invest Act, Congresswoman Stansberry, to her credit, included 8 requests for earmarks in this appropriations bill. And 2 of those are for the city of Albuquerque. $1 million request for the Violence Intervention Program Trauma Treatment Center, and $500,000 for Daniel Webster Park. In total, the delegation included 8 earmark requests. That is the 2 senators and the congresswoman together. The total of those requests is about $17.8 million. I can tell you that at this point, Congresswoman Stansberry's 2 requests actually are in appropriations bills. The House has pretty much marked up all 12 of its subcommittee appropriations. The Senate is going to begin that process. It's rumored that they're going to start next week with 3 bills: Milcon, Veterans Affairs, Energy and Water, and Agriculture. Senator Heinrich happens to be on 2 of those committees. So I feel that the city was pretty successful in getting earmark requests put together and submitted. Because it was the first year in 10 years that we've done this process, there was a lot of information that was requested that had never been requested before. And one of the things that I know was a challenge for city staff, and it was just one of those things that couldn't be controlled, is we were asking city staff to come up with letters of support and fill out the forms. At the same time, many of them were having to do city budget related work for your 21-22 budget year. So again, I really appreciate the work that folks did. I think that is pretty much covers. Let me just say where we are with the authorization bill, surface transportation, and the bipartisan legislation. So you've probably been following this. You've heard about it in the news. Where we are is the House passed the Invest Act in America. That bill has a number of titles in it. It has highways, transit, aviation, water, and sewer. I should have said not aviation. That's one bill that is being prepared on the House side as part of what may be this bigger bipartisan bill that's being discussed in the Senate. So the House bill is done. It was approved. It has earmarks in it. It has about 1,475 earmarks in it. There's a big question about whether those earmarks are ever going to get funded, because there are discussions going on now as the Senate works on the bipartisan infrastructure agreement that will essentially address all these same program areas that are in the House bill. But the Senate way back in the spring said that it was not going to take earmark projects in its surface transportation legislation, which is the highway bill. The Senate has not done the title yet for transit. So the request that the city submitted, and we made the effort through the CD1 office when it was vacant, working with the staff that were there, but no projects could be submitted to the House T&I committee just by offering them. You had to have a member submit them. It had to be sponsored by a member. So we couldn't do that. When Congresswoman Stansberry came in, I spoke to her right after she was sworn in and spoke with Scott Forrester about the city's request. They made an attempt to get those in. They submitted them. However, what happened was the timing was just not good because the House had just taken the Invest in America Act to the Rules Committee. And once it went through rules and was given a rule for a House floor debate, it was impossible to add anything like projects to that. I mean, that was just not going to happen. But the Congresswoman and her staff made the effort to, and as Isaac and Tom Minicucci know, we made a lot of effort at getting letters of support, also working the network of people to appeal to the Congresswoman to do as much as she could, which she did. So at this point, as I've explained to city staff, I'm not optimistic about those projects, the two of the city's projects being included. However, I'd say this, in talking with the Congresswoman's office, I think there's a feeling on the House side and to some degree on the Senate, but offices are playing this rather close, that if they wind up with a large bipartisan package, that what we may have is something that looks similar to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act by President Obama, where there was funding made available to federal agencies, and then local governments would apply to those agencies, submit grants for stimulus. They're not calling it stimulus, that's my term, but infrastructure funding. So what I would say, and I was just talking earlier to several people that are colleagues of mine on the Hill about this, and their advice was, if you've got projects, make sure that they're on the shelf and ready to be funded. And anything you can do in that. And I think maybe the Congresswoman may have already had this kind of a conversation with city officials about looking forward to opportunities to fund projects through this bipartisan infrastructure program. And Madam Chairman, that concludes my remarks on this.
Thank you, Mr. O'Donnell. Does anyone have any questions on those remarks for Mr. O'Donnell? All right, seeing none, do the members have in front of them the draft version of R21-181 that Mr. Minicucci circulated earlier today? Yesterday, I think.
Madam Chair, I did have a question. I'm sorry, pardon the interruption.
Oh, go ahead, Councilor Bassan.
Thank you. We had council staff send over a couple questions regarding the museums, and this might not be for Mr. O'Donnell so much as the city, but I'm wondering what the $1 million for one museum and $500,000 for the other museum are going to be used for. Specifically, I'm kind of just trying to follow up on what's been done with the other $1 million that we obtained earlier in this year from the CARES funding.
Thank you, Councilor Bassan. So let me just, before responding to that, if it's okay, make sure that everybody has a copy of our -21-181 for Mr. Minicucci. It sounds like we do. Great. And so you can refresh our memory, Tom, but I think we started on this sort of late last year, earlier this year, maybe in March, and sort of hit pause on it until now. Can you help us remember that?
Regarding the bill, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
The bill is simply there. We did it because we have to include the priorities by our ordinance in our federal priorities resolution. So like John said, we started in March and then just had to go, because the Congressional Earmarks program was just developing, we had to kind of go through that whole process and work with it was developing. We decided to wait until we sent in all our earmarks before we put the bill on the floor. Because since it was a developing bill, we really couldn't kind of pre-decide which projects. We kind of had to wait as the Senate and the House developed their criteria. And then unfortunately, it turned out regarding the Senate case that the good criteria didn't really come to like about 3 or 4 days before it was due. So which of course meant some number of city staffers were working on Memorial Day weekend, I think, or Labor Day Memorial, I think it was day weekend. So that's why we had to wait until that was due. Once we got the final projects in, we then knew what our list was, and that's what we're submitting to right now.
Thank you, Mr. Minicucci. Okay, I'm caught up to you now, Councilor Bassan. So are you asking about the African American Museum and Cultural Center?
And the Holocaust Museum, Madam Chair, yes. I know that those were two that seemed to be added on towards the end. And I know that earlier this year, we funded $1 million to the African American community centers, I believe. And I'm just wondering what that money is going to, especially if is this totally separate, or is this going to be something they add together for $2 million total for a new community center or the cultural center? And then what is kind of the plan? Can we hear a little bit about what the dreams are for a Holocaust museum?
Sure. So I'm asking Isaac, Mr. Padilla, to look up the money you're talking about, because I'm not sure that I remember that in ARPA, but we'll look that up. In the meantime, both of these are community generated projects that have been kicking around for quite some time. When the African American Performing Arts Center, I remember, was constructed on the state fairgrounds, even at that time, there were bigger plans for an African American museum and cultural center. And then the Holocaust Museum has a long and sort of storied history with the city, including, at one time there was actually city space reserved for it, and so on. And so some of you who have been around with the city, Mr. Minicucci or Mr. Thompson, probably could give a much better background than I, but it is still that same vision of a project. And so, Isaac, you're pulling up.
This is the enacted legislation.
We're pulling up the enacted legislation, and I don't know if you have it in front of you, Counselor, but I'm not seeing anything for either of these projects. There's a balloon museum money, but
No, this was on the CARES, Madam Chair, the original funding that came out, not the ARPA.
oh, the CARES.
We ended up, the council ended up approving $1 million. And I don't have it with me, and I should have. My apologies, but I know that there was the African American, I believe it was the community center or community. And we had some discussions on what was to be used with that funding, and we were going to hear about it later. And I'm just wondering what has come of that $1 million, and is that going to be combined with this new requested earmark of $1 million?
Thank you for the clarification, Counselor. We pulled up the ARPA bill instead of the CARES bill, our bad, but we'll pull that one up. And then meantime, I think if any of our other participants want to speak to either the history of either of these projects before this administration, we'd welcome those comments.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I'm sorry, my raise hand function's not working, but I was just, hi everyone. I was just going to say that I think Councilor Bassan's referring to the $1 million from just to the African American community groups. It wasn't for a museum per se.
Oh, okay, thank you. So you're referring perhaps to the $1 million for the Black Community Investment Fund that was taken from CARES money back in June of last year.
That seems right, Madam Chair. And I'm just, again, wondering if this is going to be added to it, if this is totally separate, and kind of what, just to make sure that we have some clarification on where we're at with some of these pretty large funding sources. And then I guess another follow-up on that is just the Holocaust Museum. Is $500 to start the design, or do we already have money? And I guess, forgive me for being new to hearing about this. I think it's a great idea. I just wasn't sure if this is to get us started and rolling with it, or if this is to kind of finish it off and get the final funding for it.
Sure. So let me start with the Black Community Investment Fund. That is completely separate. Those were not capital dollars intended for a capital project. A group of folks from a lot of different parts of the African American community came together with the help of the One Albuquerque Fund and put together sort of a council that made a roadmap for how to spend that money. And part of it is through giving grants, and those grant applications I think are up online now. So be happy to share that detail with you. And then there is a portion of the money that they wanted to set aside for longer, bigger picture projects, but I'm happy to share all that with all of the members. And I don't know whether they were intending to present at the first or the second council meeting back, but I do know that they did want to come and present to the council on where they landed with that money. So, but that was never intended for capital purposes, so it wasn't related to the museum. With respect to the Holocaust Museum, let me go to these folks for the history first. But I will say that, yeah, $500,000 would be, I think, more to like refresh and update plans that have been out there for some time. But Mr. Thompson, you look like you're getting ready to say something.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And hi, everyone, Councilor Bassan. And yeah, this is a project that I was actually on their board of the Holocaust and Intolerance Center many, many years ago when I was in the legislature. And we secured a ton of support from the New Mexico legislature. And then in the Berry administration, there was a building that was designated that turned out it just had significant remediation needs with asbestos and other things. And so that sort of fell off. I apologize that I'm not able to give a current update on that project, but I know it's been a labor of love for a lot of folks for a long time.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Did you want to add anything, Mr. Minicucci?
No, ma'am, except that the building was, I believe, the Rosenwald building.
Right. Yeah, that was my understanding as well. And then that because of the massive costs, that the city ended up selling that building, and the Holocaust and Intolerance Museum currently lives sort of over by the launch pad on Central between 5th and 6th, I want to say maybe, or 6th and 7th. But I'm sure one of us can find the old plans for that. And the idea was to really revive that. The community really asked us to put in the ask to revive that and update those plans and see if we couldn't move that forward after it had been backburnered for some time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And if I may, I would really like to hear, and I'm excited to hear about the update at the first or second council meeting when we return. It was one of those somewhat vague allocations of funding that we did. So I'm really happy to hear kind of what's come of that for some follow-up, but also in the Holocaust Museum. So it's already existing there. I know what you're talking about. So we're looking at improving it, which I think would be great too. And then if we can maybe further talk some other time about the Rosenwald building that we just sold. And that's also going to be a substation and remediation and all of the things that now you just heard a whole bunch of other questions. But I'm happy to do that offline, not during this meeting as it's not really relevant to these conversations. But thank you for all the clarification and getting me updated.
Thank you. So back on R-181, did anybody have any other comments, questions, changes that they wanted to introduce to either the text of the resolution or the project list?
Madam Chair, if I may, to ask the committee's favor, Mr. O'Donnell identified in the project list where we probably need to, for his presentation to people in Washington, if we can break out the two T&I projects, which I believe is the rail trails and the UNSER request, that we would just kind of, if we could amend it to go forward between now and council, staff would prepare for the sponsor, Councilor Pena, just an amendment of those to create two tables, and one would just have those other two projects, and that would be for Mr. Thompson or Mr. O'Donnell. I'm right, the transportation, and there's another name for it that we would give rather than community development projects.
Surface transportation authorization.
So that would just be one amendment we would like to go for, if it's the committee's favor, if that could go forward.
I'd like to make that motion, and Mr. Minicucci, you can kind of read it into the record.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. Or yeah, I mean, yes, Councilor Pena. So the bill would be to amend the table for R-182 to include, to remove from the Community Development Act list the projects Unser Boulevard between Kimmick and Paradise, and the Rail Trails Phase 1 and 2 projects, and to remove them from that list to create a second list called the Surface Transportation Act list. Is that correct, Mr. O'Donnell?
You ought to call it Surface Transportation Authorization - Member Designated Projects.
So I think that name there to go forward to council.
Thank you. So we have a motion from Councilor Pena. Do we have a second? We got a second. Many seconds. I saw Councilor Senna. I heard Mr. Pulley. Any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I think we can just vote by acclamation rather than roll call in this context unless someone starts waving their hands at me. So all in favor say yes.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, hearing none, that motion passes. So we now still have in front of us our 181 and as amended. So I think we'd be looking for a motion. Do we do pass out of this committee? I can't remember, but we would be forwarding this to the council.
It'd be, Madam Chair, we believe that this is not, it would be a forward with recommendation to approve. I don't think it has to be just a recommendation. I believe it has to do a do pass.
Mhm. So, Madam Chair, I'd make the urge everyone's support as a close, I guess. I don't know if we're doing this all officially, but and then make a motion for a do pass.
Thank you, Councilor Pena. There's a second from Councilor Sena. Thank you, Councilor Sena. Is there any further discussion? Okay, seeing none, all in favor say yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, that passes unanimously. Thank you, everyone. The next item on our agenda is discussion with City of Albuquerque, Washington liaisons on preparation of project submittals, which we kind of did first just because I messed it up. But do we have anything else that we want to hear about on that topic or any other questions or anything you wanted to add, Mr. O'Donnell? Oh, go ahead, Mr. Padilla.
Madam Chair, I'd like to ask Mr. O'Donnell to explain, like, you said that you wanted to have a training session from some staff members in the departments. Can you explain what you had recommended to us?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chairman, Mr. Padilla. Thanks for that question. Yes, I think what I started out by saying at the first part of this report about the lessons learned, so to speak, from this year, that it would be really advantageous for us in putting together next year's program, legislative priorities, and project requests if September, October, we had a workshop in whatever sort of organization would be best for council staff, city staff, departments, to go over what we learned from this year, but really to talk about the concerns or the questions that staff have about preparing these requests. And I mentioned that there were 33 eligible federal program accounts. When you look at where the city requested funding, earmark funding, we really, I think we had two subcommittees that we essentially dealt with in requests. That was transportation and housing and urban development, and what they call commerce, justice, and science. And our requests, as far as program accounts go, really went to COPS technology, the Burn JAG Justice Assistance Grant, and funding under HUD, which comes from the Economic Development Initiative. And we probably could expand on that. As I said in the quarterly report that I just sent folks, there are several other program areas with the Corps of Engineers, with the Department of Homeland Security, that we might want to draw on. So the concept here is to have a meeting September or October, preferably September, where we sit down in person and have a presentation to staff and others who are interested about the appropriations process and how we can go forward identifying projects and what you should be looking for in terms of projects that really would have good capability of being funded. So that's what I'm proposing.
Thank you, Mr. O'Donnell. Did you have any other questions on that? No, thank you. Yes, I know Councilor Pena has long advocated for us getting more money into the city from more diverse sources. And I believe this year the council funded a additional grants position to start to work on that sort of thing. So this feels like it would be very much in alignment with all of those efforts. Anyone have any other questions or comments on that topic?
Madam Chair, just one addition to the what Mr. O'Donnell said. When working with the mayor's office staff, the other thing too we were thinking of doing was also, if the earlier the projects can be identified, It allows one for those projects to be prepared to be shovel ready, gives the project managers time. Second question is it would possibly give the time for the project managers or for the sponsoring elected officials to maybe be able to meet and maybe to show the congressional delegation the project. So that way they become familiar with it. That's the model that we've been following with that Mr. Thompson introduced in the state process about 4 or 5 years ago. And of course, the new administration came in and really brought in the same model and went after it. And then we've seen it really improve the city's ability to form relationships with legislatures for funding. So we're thinking of trying to somewhat repeat that on this level.
Thank you, Mr. Minicucci. Anyone else? All right, well, let me add mine and the administration's thanks to everyone else's for the amount of work that went into putting together these federal requests. Mr. O'Donnell, you and your staff, council staff, and of course, the administration that worked on that. We're really appreciative that we got them in. I guess we'll see what happens. We'll move on to the last item on our agenda, which is discussion with the City of Albuquerque State Legislature liaisons on interim committees. Mr. Thompson, are you reporting from a hallway in the Tamaya, or are you?
Madam Chair, how could you tell? Did you? I don't know if you saw Chairman Munoz peer over my shoulder in a menacing way.
Please proceed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's great to be here. And I have spent the better part of the past few weeks moving around talking with folks from the legislature, from the Association of Counties, from the governor's office, from the Legislative Finance Committee, AJ over at the Municipal League, and everybody is freaking out about ARPA. Nobody really knows what the process is going to look like, how it's going to work. And this is a real compliment to you, Madam Chair, and the city. Everybody's looking at Albuquerque as being the most organized entity in the state as it relates to that stuff. So that's something I think we should all be very proud of. I can tell you that there's a lot of optimism up here, and folks are very excited about how all this could be transformational for ARPA funds, could be transformational for some of the folks that need it most. The legislature is starting to pick up its pace as it relates to hearings. The Legislative Finance Committee obviously has been meeting the whole time, but the other interim committees have not really picked up their pace yet. So I know one of the things Mr. Minicucci and I have discussed, and it's something that the executive folks have already been doing. Excuse me. You all have already been doing is meeting with certain agencies and finding the right opportunities to interact with some of the decision makers at the executive branch of the state to put our best foot forward and maybe get some of our programs funded, projects funded. So I think that opportunity is upon us. The executive agency budgets are due on September 1st. So, the opportunity is there, and I think we just need to consider the right projects to meet with the right folks. And I'll stand for any questions you might have, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, if I just may add real quickly, one of the things we were talking about too is that this administration is taking advantage of the interim committees, because oftentimes, particularly for short session years, that's where the beginning part of legislation begins, and you begin to build the consensus to bring it forward into the full sessions, which are often short. So I think we were also looking at expanding that into the council. A number of times councilors will have bills that they would like to propose. However, there's state laws that do not make it possible or need some amendment to make the bill more effective. And so we're just trying to, I think, introduce it to the council at this meeting today. And then we as council staff hope to meet with our IGR members and maybe make it more familiar, bring it forward to the council, that getting more, I think, robust or more active in meeting with the interim committees might be where they can begin to make amendments to state law or influence state laws that could help support city ordinances, to get them, that's be the beginning spot, and then have them a little bit more further along and prepared when they go into the final session.
That's a great idea. Thanks to both of you. So is the concept that we might try to pass the city goals legislation earlier than we have historically, so you can have that in hand when talking to interim committees?
We didn't think about that, Madam Chair, but that's a good idea. I mean, and
Madam Chair, that certainly is along the lines of what I've been thinking. The our VIP program is a perfect example of that, of where there is support for it and people do see the value. But when you're talking about, it's more than just the merits of it, because you got to find the money for it. And as these agencies are submitting their budgets by the 1st, it's nice to be out in front of them right now. So I know that there's work going on and along those lines amongst our executive folks. And it seems like there's other opportunities that for all city folks to be able to make their case for programs and ideas that should be brought forward.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Any questions, comments on that? So I think the way we've done this historically is we've all sort of sent our stuff to Mr. Minicucci, who rolls it all up into the priorities bill. We normally try to start with some citywide priorities, and then in the back is the longer list of projects that are or more tied to a specific location. So if you'd be willing to do that work for us again, Tom, we would love to do that. And then if you council can tell your colleagues to do the same, we can maybe try to get this before out of this committee and before the council in early September. Or I mean, I'm willing to take a stab at the 2nd August meeting, but I don't know that it makes a whole difference for your timeline, but we'll defer to council on the timing on that, and we'll just get our stuff to Mr. Minicucci. Any sound good to everybody? Any questions or comments on that? Okay. Any other business for this committee? All right. Well, counselors, enjoy your last few days of freedom. We will see you on Monday, not next Monday, Monday after. And everybody have a great day. Thanks for your time. Appreciate you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Adjourned.